All right, to finish up talking about ecology, I still want to talk a bit more about global processes in the ecosystems of the world. We've already talked about the carbon cycle, where carbon atoms keep moving through an ecosystem. The main driving force is, first of all, that photosynthesis sucks CO2, carbon dioxide gas, out of the atmosphere, and plants can use that to convert carbon dioxide into sugars and more complex compounds that they need. We call this fixing carbon. And then when consumers and decomposers eat plants, that eventually puts carbon dioxide back in the atmosphere. So the main driving force here is photosynthesis and respiration. And of course, there's other sources of CO2, fires, volcanoes, and other things that will take it out. But the main thing is respiration, breathing out CO2, and photosynthesis. We often have to talk about the hydrologic cycle, or just the water cycle, which you may remember my kid had this in kindergarten, and it's pretty obvious. Energy from the sun makes water evaporate from oceans and other bodies of water. So water vapor goes into the atmosphere, and then it comes out of the atmosphere in the form of rain or snow, hail, sleet, whatever it is we're talking about. And rain, of course, may either fall right into the oceans, or it may fall on land and end up running into ditches, which run into creeks, which run into rivers and lakes, which eventually run into the oceans. You can get water that ends up frozen for a long time, as in the polar ice caps, or that sinks underground in the form of groundwater, the water that supplies springs and wells and things like that. But there's the hydrologic cycle in one photo. That's a rain cloud over the Pacific Ocean. Water evaporates from the earth, forms water vapor in the skies, and then the water vapor forms droplets and then rains back down. So you've got the entire cycle right there captured in one picture. Living things also have to have nitrogen. You might remember that, this is one of the atoms in CHON, and nitrogen is needed to make both amino acids and bases for nucleic acids. It's also used in some types of carbohydrate as well. And there's enormous amounts of nitrogen in the atmosphere. The air you breathe is something like 78% nitrogen. The problem is that nitrogen gas is very difficult hard to break down. Most living things can't break down nitrogen in the air and turn it into a usable form. There's two things that can do that. One is certain bacteria that we call nitrogen fixing bacteria, and the other is lightning. A great big electrical spark shooting through the air will convert nitrogen gas into compounds that organisms can absorb, ammonia and nitrates, things like NO2, nitrogen dioxide. Those get taken up by producers, so plants take up nitrogen out of the soil. You get your nitrogen by eating plants, and that's where you get the compounds that make your own amino acids and your own DNA and RNA bases, which all use nitrogen. Of course, when plants and animals die and decay, the decomposers get their nitrogen and eventually might release it back to the next generation of plants, and so on. Ultimately, there's also some bacteria called denitrifying bacteria, and both nitrogen fixers and denitrifying bacteria are pretty common in soils, for example. And denitrifiers break down nitrogen compounds and release nitrogen gas back to the atmosphere completing the cycle. So the big driving force here is basically bacteria. Here's another great example of a mutualistic symbiosis. That's roots of soybean, I believe. And you can see these little round lumps on their roots, like that. Dr. Mukherjee in our department actually studies these. Those lumps on the roots, these nodules, are jam-packed full of nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Those provide nitrogen to the host plant. They ultimately make nitrogen available to other plants and animals. And it's mutualism. They get a place to live that's very protected, and the plants that have these nodules get nitrogen to grow, nitrogen that they need. This is typical of legumes. That's the plant family that includes beans, peas, and also alfalfa and clover. Growing clover on your land and then plowing it under is one way to prepare the soil for planting other crops. It actually makes the soil more fertile because of those nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Last cycle I want to talk about is the cycle of phosphorus. That's the P in schnapps, and you need phosphorus to make ATP, and also the phosphate part of your nucleic acids, right? Remember, sugar, phosphate, base. You also need it for things like bones and teeth, in your case. What drives the phosphorus cycle is rocks eroding. Wherever rocks crumble and weather away, phosphorus is actually released from certain rocks. It gets into the local water supply, and it can be taken up by producers, consumers, and so on. It'll cycle through the biosphere. Ultimately, it washes off, ends up in the oceans, and it may end up staying for many millions of years in the layers of sediment that build up on the bottom of the ocean, the layers of sand and mud that are dumped into the ocean by rivers. And then very, very long, slow processes of things like mountain building, geological processes we haven't even really had time to talk about, will very slowly turn that mud on the bottom of the oceans into new rock layers and force them upwards to create new land and new mountains. And ultimately that returns phosphorus to the cycle. So this one is basically driven by geology, and it takes a very long time to complete. In fact, in agriculture, most of the nitrogen fertilizer that's used in agriculture is actually artificially made by a chemical process that we can use to take nitrogen gas out of the atmosphere and turn it into ammonia. It's a piece of chemistry called the Haber-Bosch process. Fritz Haber, the guy who invented it, it is said that 2 out of every 5 people alive today are alive because of the Haber-Bosch process, because it made nitrogen fertilizer extremely cheap. The phosphorus that you need for agriculture is mined from areas that are rich in phosphate-based rock. And this rock can be ground up and added to soils. Unfortunately, you can make this about number 173 on the list of shit you have to worry about. World supplies of phosphates are going to start declining sometime in the next 30 years. So how long we can keep up the type of fertilizer intensive agriculture that we do, I'm not entirely sure. In industrial agriculture today, if you're growing corn, let's say, up in Iowa, where my dad is from, they grow ridiculous amounts of corn, of maize. And corn is pretty nitrogen hungry, so the farmers will dump large amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer on the fields, typically more than they really need. A lot of it is, of course, taken up by the corn plants, but what the plants don't use will wash out of the soil every time it rains. And you can see here this little drain pipe draining excess water off of a cornfield. That water, which is now rich in excess nitrogen and phosphorus, runs into ditches, which run into creeks, which run into rivers and lakes. And when a body of water gets a huge input of nutrients like this, all of a sudden there's ridiculous amounts of fertilizer and bacteria and algae bloom. All of a sudden there's a huge amount of nutrients, so they grow very, very rapidly. They'll choke the water. You can see how this water is just covered in green scum. And those algae, like all things, eventually die and decay. And algae are photosynthetic. They produce oxygen as a byproduct, but rotting algae on the bottom consumes oxygen. Decay is like a very slow form of eating, and it burns oxygen to do it. So you can end up with lakes where most of the water is so low in oxygen that nothing can live in it. And this is a process you can see around here, like in farm ponds, especially if the farmer's not really careful about where his cow manure or his pig manure is washing into. You can get ponds around here in the summer that get really green and soupy. The fancy name for this is eutrophication. And so this summer, keep your eyes out if you're in Arkansas for eutrophied bodies of water. It's a pretty common problem around here. And it'll kill fish. If you've got, fish trying to survive in that pond, they'll all just go belly up as soon as the decay of these algae sucks all the oxygen out of the water. And it can be bigger than that. This is a satellite picture of Lake Erie. This is one of the 5 Great Lakes. Up here, this is Canada, this part right there. All right, all that's Canada. That's Detroit, Michigan. This is Cleveland, Ohio. That's Erie, Pennsylvania, I do believe. And right there's the city of Toledo, Ohio, all major cities on Lake Erie. What happens in the spring and summer is that farmers in the rural country, way down here in southern Ohio, dump lots of fertilizer on their fields, and the excess washes off and ends up in Lake Erie. Some of these towns may also discharge sewage into local rivers. They're supposed to treat it, but they may not always. And that ends up in the river as well. Okay, and I'm just doodling, but there's Canada. There's a maple leaf to remind us it's Canada. Okay. So that means that in the spring and summer, Lake Erie gets big doses of fertilizer, of agricultural fertilizer and untreated sewage. And that can create these enormous blooms of algae, like all of this cloudy green stuff. That's a huge bloom of algae. And this matters because some algae get really toxic if you have lots of them growing in one place. In August 2014, Toledo, right over here, temporarily had to shut off the city water because Toledo gets its water from Lake Erie, and there was so much algae growing in Lake Erie that the water got dangerous. 400,000 people had to make do with bottled water and couldn't flush their toilets. So this can be a pretty big problem. Eutrophication can. You hear a lot these days about organic food, and Mostly it's not that much better for you to eat organic than not, although some of the pesticides that get used in non-organic food probably aren't that good for you. But the real point of organic farming is to use natural cycling as much as possible. So here you've got a compost pile right here. An industrial farmer is going to go buy nitrogen and phosphorus, spread them on the fields. A lot of that will wash out into creeks and rivers and lakes, and eventually it'll end up in the ocean. It's basically a one-way trip. When you do composting like this, if you're growing your own food and composting the parts that you don't eat, letting them rot, producing good compost, and then spreading that on your fields, you're keeping nutrients cycling through your garden, through your local backyard ecosystem, instead of having to buy fresh stuff all of the time. Instead of having to keep buying fertilizer, you can keep your nitrogen, phosphorus, and some other things we haven't talked about called micronutrients going through your ecosystem as many times as you can. And you minimize the stuff you have to bring in and pay for from outside. That's what's great about organic farming. You make use of ecological cycling as much as possible if you're doing it right. And again, this mimics what you see in nature. Nobody has ever had to fertilize a forest because, for example, when trees grow and drop their leaves, the leaves fall to the floor, they rot. Ultimately, their nutrients go back into the soil, and eventually they'll be used by new generations of trees. So the point of organic farming is to try to tap into the cycles that are already going on and use them in ways that produce good food. Okay. We've talked about how elements cycle, and a lot of it's driven by trophic relationships, basically who is eating whom. You get your carbon, you get your oxygen from the air, but you get your carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, right? You get a lot of your chnops from what you eat. And a lot of cycling is partly driven by critters eating critters. But the last thing I want to mention is that there's many more ways in which one species can affect others in an ecosystem. And we can designate some species as keystone species because those are species whose presence in an ecosystem has a major effect on the total ecosystem. Just like if you have an arch and you pull out the keystone up at the top of the entire arch collapses. If you pull out a keystone species, that fundamentally alters the ecosystem in a lot of ways, and it changes it completely. Losing a keystone species has this ripple effect, or maybe domino effect is a better metaphor. Keystone species are sometimes apex predators. You might remember that term from Monday, but they aren't necessarily. They may not be predators at all. And I'll show you one that I haven't seen in Arkansas except at the Little Rock Zoo, but you ought to check them out there. This is a rodent in the genus Cynomys, commonly known as the prairie dog, although it's not a dog at all. Prairie dogs live in burrows on North American prairie, and they build these very large communal burrows where you might have, hundreds of prairie dogs living in, this warren, this big burrow system honeycombing the soil. Okay, so what? Well, that burrowing activity increases the soil's ability to retain water. When it rains, water soaks into the burrows. It can soak into unused burrows. It soaks into the soil in general that's made more loose by the burrowing activity. More water soaks in. That means more plant species grow. That attracts grazing animals. like our North American pronghorns, for example. They're sometimes called antelope, although they technically are not, but they look a bit like African antelope, North American pronghorn. Don't get them in Arkansas, but you'll see them if you ever go out west. The burrows also attract insects, which in turn will attract bug-eating birds. And then abandoned burrows can be used by habitat for rabbits and lizards and owls. And then, of course, the prairie dogs themselves are food for black-footed ferrets and foxes, hawks, badgers. So this would be a keystone species. Prairie dogs have been wiped out of a lot of their old prairie habitat when it was turned to farmland. And as a result, the ecosystem of most of Western North America is very different from what it used to be. Take out the prairie dogs and you change the character of everything. Every other living species in the ecosystem is affected. So, keystone species. So, if you wipe out a keystone species, it might really change the ecosystem, but who really cares? You know, I care about things like this because I'm basically an old dirt hippie, but some of you folks are business majors and you're going to go on to go make money. So just for fun, you may be thinking, all right, it's all very well that we have adorable species and all that people want to save, but what's really important is jobs and the American economy and all that. So why should we worry about saving endangered species or preserving nature or any of that stuff like that? That, as Cartman says, it's all a bunch of tree-hugging hippie crap. So just for fun, there's an endangered species right there. Aeluropoda melanoluca, the giant panda, an absolutely adorable, cute, and fluffy endangered species. That just probably makes you want to go up and cuddle it. Compare the panda with a disgusting, slimy, hideous sea slug called Dolabella auricularia. Now, let's say you had the choice to save one of these species for the future and let the other one go extinct. Now, which one would you prefer? You can share an answer in the chat if you feel like it, but I'm going to guess that most of you feel a lot more, warm to adorable, fuzzy, cute teddy bear looking pandas, as opposed to hideous, disgusting sea slugs, right? I'm assuming most of you would not particularly want to cuddle a sea slug. Okay, they're kind of slimy. Which one's worth more effort in trying to preserve? Well, it's a trick question, of course. I'm not saying pandas aren't worth saving. Dolabella's poisonous if you eat it, which makes sense. A lot of ocean critters, Dolabella lives in the shallow ocean, are soft, squishy, and live in a world where they have lots of predators with lots of teeth. So a lot of soft, squishy critters taste really bad as a means of defense. Now, poisons that taste really bad are really interesting to the pharmaceutical industry because, as the great alchemist Paracelsus once said, it's the dose that makes the poison. An awful lot of drugs are poisons if you take too much, and an awful lot of poisons are useful as drugs if you regulate the amount and use it just right. So in the 1980s, someone looked at the toxins in Dolabella auricularia and found compounds called dolastatins. And dolastatins block mitosis. You might remember that because they interfere with these spindle fibers, which is another thing you should remember. That's those fibers that drag the chromosomes around. There is now a modified version of one dolastatin called brentuximab vedotin that's being used to treat certain types of a cancer called lymphoma, notably a type of cancer called Hodgkin's lymphoma. I'm not sure if it's being used to treat the cancer that my wife's mother has. She has another type of lymphoma, but it might. It's now a chemotherapy agent that sometimes can save or prolong lives. That's only one dolastatin. There's actually others that are being investigated. And there's about 4,000 other species of sea slug that we know of so far. And it might be interesting to look at what they have in their tissues. Maybe we could find more medications, better ones, safer ones, ones for treating other types of cancer. This does not mean that we ought to let the pandas die, but it means there's direct value in saving lives and in making money in preserving living things that don't look adorable and fuzzy and don't have eyes and eat bamboo shoots and become the mascot of, is it Tri Sigma? One of our sororities has pandas. And in fact, we've been extracting medicines from plants for as long as humanity's been around. It's even before humans had fully evolved. We think our primate ancestors were doing it. Chimps and orangutans do it. Will use certain plants as medicine. And we've been doing this all through recorded history, and it continues to go on. Something like 25% of all of our prescription drugs are either derived from plants or they were discovered in plants. We might make them in other ways, but we wouldn't have found them if somebody didn't go looking at plants. And here's an example. I can finally talk about an African-American scientist. We haven't had the opportunity to meet many of them because for a lot of our history, participating in science or education was rather strongly discouraged. But I can mention a guy named Percy Julian, a chemist who worked out ways to extract useful compounds from soybeans and from this plant, a rather weird looking thing called Mexican yam, Dioscorea barbata. The compounds he was able to get out of these plants are the basis of artificial steroid hormones. He wasn't the discoverer of hormonal birth control, but his work made it possible to make birth control pills safely and inexpensively. If you're not into that, his work also made possible cortisone, the stuff you might have got an injection of if you sprained an ankle or something like that. And he's the one who figured out how to make these substances very inexpensively, renewably from precursor chemicals that are found in these plants. One of the winners of the Nobel for Medicine in 2015 is a Chinese researcher named Tu Youyou, I think I pronounced that right, who developed a drug from a Chinese plant called sweet wormwood, Artemisia annua, which is shown over there at the right. And it's one of the frontline treatments now for malaria, which may not be something you worry about too much. We have almost no malaria in Arkansas. Globally, it used to kill as many as 1 million people a year, mostly children. The numbers have actually been going down. I think the current estimate is about 400,000 people a year dying of malaria. So globally, this is a major problem. And Dr. Tu, actually, she did not get a PhD. Never mind, grew up in China during the Cultural Revolution and had to get her education in other ways. But her discovery has saved and will continue to save countless lives from one of the worst killer diseases on the planet. We can use biodiversity to create new foods. This is one I saw in Kroger, Salem Road, Kroger, a couple of months ago. The plant on the left grows in South America, and it's called Ilex guayusa, and its leaves are rich in caffeine. And a company called Runa makes energy drinks out of guayusa. They buy their leaves from small farmers in Ecuador. So they're providing a livelihood to thousands of Ecuadorian small farmers. Who, by the way, can pick the leaves but don't have to kill the plant, so they can harvest this sustainably, meaning they can keep doing it as long as they want to. The company has about 400 employees in the US, so it's jobs for us, it's jobs for Ecuadorians, and it's a rather refreshing and pleasant tasting caffeine-rich tea that you ought to try sometime if you're into drinking energy drinks and teas and things like that. It's good stuff. So that's a way of using biological diversity in ways that benefit everybody. We have hundreds of thousands of chemicals known from animals and plants. Many of them are useful as drugs. 1/4 of all prescriptions written in the United States are for drugs that either are derived from plants or were originally discovered in plants. Everything from the anti-rejection drugs that make organ transplants possible to aspirin and Sudafed are derived from living things. And we're always finding more. There's other compounds that are useful as sources of fuel, sources of food, dyes, natural products like rubber. We're using a ridiculous amount of biological diversity. And living things can provide indirect services. Here's some insect-eating bats. Nice little flock of Tatarida brasilensis flying around eating insects at dusk. One of these guys will eat on average of one mosquito every 10 seconds all night long. If you have ever been outside in Arkansas in the summer, you know that this is an important thing, right? That's an awful lot of mosquitoes that are no longer available to bite you. It's been calculated that insect-eating bats save the US agricultural industry at least $3 billion every year. Some estimates are as high as 53 billion. It's a little hard to measure accurately, but it's a lot of money however you look at it. And that's sometimes called an ecosystem service because, farmers don't have to pay for that. They get it for free if there's bats in the neighborhood. Crop pollination. Roughly 1/3 of your food supply depends on crop pollinators like honeybees. You'd have no berries, most of your fruits and quite a lot of your vegetables, clover and alfalfa to feed to cattle to make your burgers. All of those depend on having pollinators, like these honeybees being trucked into an apple orchard. If it wasn't for these guys, you'd lose roughly 1/3 of your food supply. Even when we don't directly harvest a product or service from something living, we get ideas from them. One of my old grad student instructors, when I was a graduate student, actually ended up founding a company based on his studies of geckos, little lizards with these big pads on their toes that can cling to almost any surface. They can go up vertical walls, run across the ceiling, and they do it because their feet are covered with millions of really tiny bristles. On the left is what a gecko foot looks like under a powerful microscope, and you can see all these bristles. The guy I know who studied geckos worked out a way to make something called geck skin, which you can buy. It's a bit expensive. That's a roll of geck skin tape that'll set you back $10. But here's the thing, you can stick it to a smooth glass surface, it'll hold, and you can peel it off easily and leave no residue behind. You have some of this, you can post anything you want to on the walls of your apartment and then take it down when you're finished. You won't leave any residue, and the landlord will have to find another way to cheat you out of your damage deposit. And we call those biomimetic designs, ideas for new products that we can get from studying nature. So for the business majors, what I hope you see is it's good business to preserve biodiversity, and you can't just save individual species because there's no such thing. Every species is part of an ecosystem and depends on other living things in that ecosystem. How big business is it? Back in 1997, Robert Costanza showed the total value of everything that's produced in the world economy, everything that people buy and sell, was $18 trillion in 1997. His best estimate for the annual value of all the goods and services that the natural environment provides, everything from recreation opportunities to the oxygen you breathe, is at least 33 and possibly 56 trillion. So between roughly 2 to 3 times the value of the global economy is the value of what nature gives you for free. That's a lot. I'll skip that, but if you want to read that, there's an estimate that if we could preserve all of the world's coral reefs, just preserving that would generate nearly $30 billion worth of goods and services in the economy. We're losing biodiversity fast. Species are being rapidly lost, possibly as many as 150 a day due to habitat loss. Introduced species like kudzu and Japanese honeysuckle that outcompete local species, and then global climate change, pollution, all of the dismal list of things that are a threat. And what I want to leave you with the fact is that this is a direct threat to our own welfare. You ought to be concerned about saving the rainforests and the prairies and the swamplands and all of that, because you directly benefit from them. For all I know, some plant somewhere that you'll never have heard of has just gone extinct, and maybe that plant contained the drug that would have cured what you're going to die from. You simply never know. And the words of a popular song from when I was in high school, there's a choice we're making, we're saving our own lives. And I'll leave you with the words of the Lorax: unless someone like you does more than care a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. And on that cheery thought, I will end the recording.